A brigadier general stepped out of a jeep at a command post in the Belgian town of St. Vith. Behind him stood 3 men, an operations officer, an aide, and a driver. It was December 17th, 1944. For the past 24 hours, the largest German offensive since Normandy had been tearing across the Ardennes. The general, standing quietly in the snow, was about to become the only thing separating 100,000 German soldiers from the collapse of the Allied front. His name was Bruce C. Clark. No one in the American press had heard of him. No one in the German high command recognized his name. Even most of the soldiers he was about to command had never seen his face. Inside the command post, Major General Alan Jones looked like a man watching his world fall apart. His 106th Infantry Division was being ripped to pieces. 2 of his 3 regiments were surrounded on the Schnee-Eifel Ridge, east of town. Communication was failing. German armor was pouring through gaps his infantry simply could not hold. Jones turned to Clark and admitted he had thrown in his last chips. Clark had arrived at St. Vith expecting nothing more than a routine passage to another assignment. Instead, he was inheriting a catastrophe. His combat command, CCB of the 7th Armored Division, was still hours away, trapped on roads choked with retreating soldiers and terrified civilians. He had no troops on hand, no prepared defenses, and almost no intelligence about what was coming. But he understood one critical fact. The Germans were already behind schedule. They needed St. Vith immediately. An entire panzer army was driving toward it. What they did not know was that the man now standing in that command post had already defeated their commander once before. The German offensive was called Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. It was Hitler's audacious plan to split the Allied armies, seize the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the west. The main thrust cut through the dense Ardennes forest of Belgium. 3 German armies attacked along a 60-mile front. And in the first 48 hours, one objective mattered more than any other. A small Belgian town most Americans had never heard of. St. Vith. The town sat at the intersection of 7 major roads and 2 rail lines. Every German division pushing west needed those routes. Without St. Vith, the offensive would choke on its own traffic. General Otto von Manchufel commanded the 5th Panzer Army, the strongest German force in the Ardennes. His orders were unmistakable. St. Vith had to fall on day 1. Manchufel personally designed the timetable. Leading divisions would smash through the thin American lines, bypass resistance whenever possible, and seize the road junction before the Allies could organize a defense. By 6 o'clock on the evening of December 16th, German tanks were supposed to be rolling through St. Vith on their way west. The schedule allowed no delays. Every hour mattered. Yet by the afternoon of December 17th, the timetable was already slipping. American resistance was stronger than expected. Traffic jams clogged the narrow forest roads. Armor struggled to move. And now, a general no one had planned for was standing in St. Vith with only 3 men. Manchufel should have known the name Bruce Clark. The last time Clark blocked his path, it cost him nearly 200 tanks. 3 months earlier, in September 1944, Clark commanded Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division during brutal fighting in the muddy fields of Lorraine. His opponent then was the same man now advancing through the snow of the Ardennes. Manchufel hurled wave after wave of panzers at Clark over 2 relentless weeks. Fresh brigades rushed in from Germany with orders to halt the American advance at any cost. But Clark refused to fight the way German commanders expected. He would not sit in fixed positions and wait for the blow. Instead, he pioneered what he called mobile defense. Small groups of Shermans constantly shifted between firing positions, appearing on one road, destroying a panther, vanishing, then reappearing miles away to strike again. German tankers reported American armor everywhere. They could never pin down Clark's strength, because Clark never stayed still long enough to be counted. When the fighting ended, Manchufel's losses were staggering. Clark lost fewer than 50 Shermans. The victory made him one of the most experienced armored commanders in the U.S. Army. Yet by December 1944, he remained largely unknown, unflashy, uninterested in publicity and indifferent to reporters. He was the kind of general who won battles quietly and let others take the spotlight. Which is exactly why no one in Germany recognized the threat when Clark arrived at St. Vith. Originally, Clark had been ordered to move through the town toward a position farther east, a routine road march. But when he stepped into Jones's headquarters, he realized something chilling. There was no farther east. Farther east was already German. Jones was exhausted. His division had been in combat for only 5 days before the offensive struck. Many of his soldiers had never fired a shot in anger. Now 2 regiments were encircled, and the 3rd was barely holding together. Jones told Clark the defense of St. Vith was now his responsibility. Clark tried to explain that his force, roughly 2,500 men with tanks and armored infantry, was still stuck miles away in traffic. It didn't matter. Jones had nothing left to give. The handover was informal. No written orders. No detailed briefing. Just one general telling another that the situation was desperate, and the defense was now his problem. Clark stepped outside and looked east into the dark forest. Somewhere out there, panzer divisions were grinding closer. He had 3 men and a radio. So he did the only thing possible. He gathered every stray unit he could find, engineers, headquarters staff, stragglers from shattered formations, and positioned them along the roads into town. These scratch forces would not stop a panzer army, but they might buy hours. And hours were exactly what Clark needed. Late on December 17th, CCB finally began arriving, about 2,500 men with tanks, artillery, engineers, and armored infantry. Not much against an entire German army. But Clark didn't need an army. He needed the Germans to think he had won. He organized his defense immediately. No sleep. No reconnaissance. Just instinct built from decades of armored warfare. And then he made the decision that defined the battle. He refused to dig in. A conventional commander would have formed a fixed defensive line east of town. Clark knew that line would be identified, targeted, and crushed within hours. Instead, he built another mobile defense. Small armored teams guarded key junctions with simple orders: strike hard, then move. Never remain long enough for German artillery to zero in. Fall back under pressure, then counterattack where least expected. Make the enemy chase ghosts. By dawn on December 18th, his defense looked fragile on paper. Scattered units, visible gaps, no continuous line. But Clark wasn't building a wall. He was creating the illusion of one. When German forces attacked on December 18th, Panzer Grenadiers expected to brush aside a thin American screen. Instead, they ran straight into Shermans. American tanks fired from concealment, destroyed the lead vehicles, and withdrew before artillery could respond. Half an hour later, those same tanks appeared miles away and slammed into a German column from the flank. The effect was psychological as much as physical. German reports described American armor across the entire front. Intelligence officers reached the exact conclusion Clark hoped for. They believed they were facing a major armored force, possibly an entire corps. Manchufel adjusted his plan. Instead of a rapid thrust, he prepared a deliberate assault. He began redirecting divisions toward St. Vith. Divisions that should have been racing toward the Meuse were now bogged down, fighting a phantom army. And every hour lost gave the Allies time to respond. Then came December 19th. The 2 surrounded regiments of the 106th Infantry Division surrendered. More than 7,000 Americans marched into captivity, the largest mass surrender of U.S. troops in Europe. Clark's flank vanished overnight. German forces poured through the gaps and streamed west around both sides of St. Vith. Clark was now an island, outnumbered, nearly surrounded. Supply lines narrowing. Any rational calculation said withdraw. Clark stayed. He tightened his perimeter around the road junction. He could not hold everything, but he could hold enough to block the roads. And every hour he held mattered. Soon, Hitler himself learned the timetable was 3 days behind, and he sent his personal sledgehammer to fix it. The Führer Begleit Brigade was no ordinary unit. Originally Hitler's escort, it had been expanded into a powerful armored formation. Its commander, Colonel Otto Ernst Riemer, was fiercely loyal and highly capable. Fresh troops joined the assault on December 20th. Pressure surged immediately. Artillery intensified. Probing attacks became full-scale assaults. Clark's men were exhausted. Ammunition dwindled. Reserves did not exist. On December 21st, Clark made another defining decision. He contracted his defenses into what headquarters later called the Fortified Goose Egg, an oval perimeter protecting the western approaches to St. Vith. Shorter lines. Fewer gaps. Concentration over coverage. Inside the perimeter, tank crews rationed ammunition. Infantry fought without relief. Medical evacuation became nearly impossible. Yet the road junction remained blocked. And every hour allowed Patton to wheel the 3rd Army north. By December 22nd, some sectors were held by barely 30 men, sergeants commanding platoons, corporals leading squads. Tankers fought until their vehicles were destroyed, then continued as infantry. Engineers laid mines and picked up rifles. Cooks and clerks filled the line. Clark himself had not slept indoors since December 17th. Night after night, he rested in his jeep, sharing the same brutal cold his soldiers endured. The human cost was staggering. Casualties exceeded 2,000. Still, the defense held. On December 22nd, Manchufel launched a massive coordinated assault. Infantry, armor, and artillery struck from 3 directions. The line buckled. German troops penetrated the perimeter. By nightfall, the eastern side collapsed. The junction Clark held for 6 days was about to fall. General Matthew Ridgway gave the order. Withdraw. Clark had bought the Allies 6 priceless days. Now he had to get his survivors out alive. On December 23rd, he executed one of the war's finest retrograde operations. Vehicles slipped out the western corridor while a rear guard simulated a full defensive line. Machine guns firing, mortars dropping rounds, enough noise to convince the Germans nothing had changed. By the time the truth emerged, most of Clark's force had escaped. 7 days after they were supposed to capture St. Vith in an afternoon, the Germans finally had the roads. But the timetable was shattered. On Christmas Eve, Manchufel bluntly recommended calling off the offensive. While Clark held, Patton turned north. Montgomery secured the northern shoulder. The 101st dug in at Bastogne. Clark had bought them the time to act. Years later, Eisenhower would call the defense of St. Vith the turning point of the Battle of the Bulge. Yet few remember it. In 1965, Bruce Clark and Asso von Manchufel met again, former enemies, now old soldiers. Manchufel revealed a long-hidden truth. German intelligence believed they had been fighting an entire American corps. Clark's 2 tank companies had fooled the 5th Panzer Army. The defense had not merely delayed the offensive. It had spoiled it. Clark listened quietly, just as he always had. He never chased fame. Never wrote a sensational memoir. Never sought the spotlight. He simply did his duty and went home. But his men knew. The survivors knew. And even the enemy commander knew. 47 critical days in December 1944. One quiet American general stood at St. Vith and changed the course of the Battle of the Bulge.